when a worker noticed a huge sinkhole right on the 9th hole. He leaned down and shone his flashlight inside, but what he saw in the depths made his blood run cold and forced him to call the police immediately. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The morning had a peculiar kind of quiet that only came before the sun fully claimed the sky. The grass still clung to dew, tiny diamonds sparkling faintly in the gray light, while a soft mist rolled across the low hills of Desert Pines Golf Club. The silence of dawn was broken only by the distant hum of sprinklers and the occasional cry of a bird searching for breakfast. On the long, rolling expanse of manicured fairways, where every blade of grass had been trained to grow to an exact height, a solitary figure moved steadily in his little maintenance cart. James Harper had been out on the course long before any of the members would arrive. It was his ritual, his rhythm, one that had defined his days for more than 20 years. 52 years old now, with a weathered face and the build of a man accustomed to hard labor, James took a kind of pride in this silent duty. He was a groundskeeper, one of the many whose work was invisible to those who came later in their pressed polos and spotless shoes. Yet, to James, the golf course was more than a job. It was a canvas, and every cut of the mower, every trimmed edge, every evenly watered patch of green was his brushstroke. He had grown up in this part of Alabama, and though the golf club had not always existed, once the land had been nothing but fields and forgotten barns, he had poured years of his life into shaping it into the pristine ground that wealthy patrons now admired. That morning was like countless others he had lived. His hands, covered with well-worn gloves, gripped the steering wheel of his specialized mower as it purred softly across the damp grass. He checked for patches of weeds, surveyed the sprinklers to make sure they had run evenly during the night, and marked in his mind the places that would need extra attention later in the day. A thermos of coffee sat in the holder at his side, already half empty. His faded cap shaded his eyes, though the sun had only just begun to lift itself above the horizon. There was something deeply comforting in this routine. The club itself was waking slowly. The clubhouse, with its cream-colored walls and tall columns, remained dark, except for a light in the kitchen, where the first cooks had begun their work. The parking lot was empty, except for a few staff cars. The air smelled faintly of wet earth, cut grass, and the lingering smoke of someone's wood-burning fireplace from a house in the distance. James had grown used to this sensory tapestry. For him, it was not simply maintenance, it was caretaking. He felt a responsibility, a duty to the land itself, almost as if he was guarding something more than just grass and soil. He drove his mower past the 7th green, noting the evenness of the roll, then curved toward the 9th hole. He was meticulous. Other groundskeepers sometimes rushed through their assigned sections, letting imperfections slip, but James never did. His father, who had worked on farms his entire life, had taught him that a man's work should reflect his name. "If you're going to do it, son," his father used to say, "do it like it's yours." And in many ways, James believed the golf course was his. It might belong to rich investors and elite members on paper, but in spirit, in care, in sweat, it was his more than anyone's. The hum of the mower seemed louder in the morning silence, vibrating through the steering wheel and into his arms. He liked the way the machine responded to his touch, the precision with which he could trim the grass to regulation length. The mower was old, with scratches and a squeak in one wheel, but it was as much a companion as a tool. He often thought of it like a loyal horse, carrying him across acres of green day after day. As the mist lifted, he could see more clearly the outlines of the bunkers filled with pale sand, the fairways stretching in ribbons, the distant flagsticks barely fluttering in the still air. It was beautiful in its own way, though not the wild beauty of untouched nature. This was order imposed on nature, a tamed landscape. That was the work of people like him, quiet, invisible shaping, and yet, even in the perfection, there were always small signs that the land had its own will. Some mornings he would find a fresh molehill near the 15th fairway. Other times, storms had carved deep grooves in the soil, undoing weeks of effort. James had a quiet respect for this resistance. No matter how many times the grounds were trimmed and leveled, nature always whispered beneath the surface, reminding him it could take back control. As he guided the mower down a slope, his thoughts wandered briefly to his family. His wife had passed away years ago, leaving him with grown children who had since moved away to cities, chasing jobs that didn't tie them to the land as he was tied. They called sometimes, visited rarely. He didn't mind. He had his routine, and in it he found peace. The solitude of the mornings was a balm, a place where he could breathe without the noise of the world pressing in. At times, however, he wondered about the history beneath his feet. His father had often spoken of the land before the club was built, how it had once been farmland, how it had changed hands through questionable deals. There were stories whispered by old-timers about bootleggers during Prohibition using the hills and hollows for hidden storage, about barns that were burned down in suspicious fires, about people who had vanished without explanation. James never knew whether to believe them, but the stories had stuck with him, like shadows on a bright day. Now, as the sun began to burn away the mist, he felt the first warmth of the day against his skin. It would be hot by noon, unbearable without the shade of trees, but in these early hours it was perfect. He finished a stretch of mowing and paused to sip the last of his coffee. He glanced across the field towards the 9th hole and noticed something odd. From a distance, the ground looked uneven, the way soil sometimes did after heavy rain. But there hadn't been rain in weeks. He frowned, adjusted the brim of his cap, and squinted. Perhaps it was just a trick of the light, shadows stretching differently in the rising sun. Still, the thought lingered. He would have to check it when he got closer. For now, though, he continued his path, humming softly to himself. It was always better to move forward, to complete the circuit before doubling back. He guided the mower along another fairway, letting the steady rhythm calm his thoughts. But even as he worked, his eyes kept drifting toward that patch of ground, that faint irregularity on the horizon. Something about it unsettled him. The golf course was supposed to be flawless, a controlled environment where no surprises lurked. Yet, here was something out of place, something he could not explain from a distance. And though he could not yet know it this morning, one that had begun, like countless others, was the morning when routine would break, when the quiet order he had built his life around would fracture. The land was whispering again, and this time James would have no choice but to listen. As the mower rumbled toward the suspicious patch near the 9th hole, he felt a strange chill crawl along his spine despite the warmth of the sun. It was nothing more than soil, he told himself. Just uneven ground, maybe a burrow collapsed, maybe roots rotted beneath the surface. But part of him knew better. Part of him remembered the old stories. And part of him, though he didn't want to admit it, felt as if the ground itself was waiting for him to come closer, to see what lay beneath. The mower rolled to a stop as James eased his foot off the pedal, the machine humming into silence. The strange patch of ground that had caught his eye from a distance now lay before him, and what he saw sent a ripple of unease through his chest. The grass here sagged as though it had been pressed down by an invisible hand. The once even carpet of green was warped, uneven, and it looked as though the earth itself had exhaled and collapsed inward. For a long moment, he simply sat there in his cart, staring, while the engine ticked faintly in the morning air. He swung his legs out and set his boots on the damp turf, their soles sinking slightly deeper than they should. He frowned. This ground was wrong. He bent, brushed his glove across the grass, and felt the subtle give beneath. It wasn't solid the way it should have been. It was spongy, soft, as though there was nothing but air beneath the surface. He straightened, his brow furrowed, and glanced back over his shoulder. The rest of the course lay serene and immaculate under the rising sun, its perfection unbroken. But here, right in front of him, nature seemed to have opened a wound. The silence pressed down heavier than before. The birds that had been singing near the clubhouse were gone. The breeze that usually lifted the leaves into a gentle dance had stilled. James took a cautious step closer, his boots crunching over the edge of the warped ground. He stopped again, testing it with the weight of one foot. The soil shifted slightly, crumbling just enough to make him pull back instinctively. His heart gave a quick, warning thud in his chest. He took a breath, tried to steady himself, and crouched low. From this angle, he could see tiny cracks splitting out like veins from the center of the depression. The cracks widened as he watched, grains of dirt trickling into the gap below. Something was happening here. Something beneath the ground. He had seen sinkholes on the news before, when sudden voids opened up under houses or roads, swallowing everything above them. Was that what he was looking at now? James rose slowly, brushing his hands on his jeans, and let his gaze sweep over the horizon. There was no one else in sight. No golfers, no other staff. The course was his alone this early in the morning. He licked his lips, tasting the faint tang of dust that already seemed to linger in the air. He had the strange sensation of being watched, though there was nothing but the empty expanse of fairway behind him. He shook it off, but the unease clung to him stubbornly. He turned and stepped back toward the mower, but stopped halfway. His instincts told him he needed to look again, closer this time. He walked back to the center of the patch and knelt down carefully, keeping his weight balanced. He pressed his palm against the grass, pushing harder now. The ground sank beneath his hand with a subtle, unsettling give. It felt like pressing against a mattress, as though the soil floated above a void. James rocked back on his heels, drawing in a slow breath. He remembered his father's words from years ago. "The land doesn't forget, son. We build on it, we shape it, but underneath, it always remembers." Those stories of hidden storage barns, of tunnels cut into hillsides, whispered through his memory again, no longer just idle tales. He straightened, his eyes scanning the depression with growing concern. The sun was higher now, burning away the last scraps of mist, and with the light came clarity. From this angle, James could see that the soil had shifted in a way that wasn't random. It wasn't just a collapsed patch. The edges curved inward in a rough oval, almost as though the ground had given way around something hollow beneath. He rubbed the back of his neck, sweat prickling his skin despite the coolness of the morning. He stepped back, gauging the size of it. 10 feet across, maybe more. The shape seemed too precise, too contained to be only the work of erosion or decay. He thought of tree roots rotting underground, of burrows caving in, but nothing about this looked natural. There was a pattern here, and it unsettled him more than anything. James returned to the mower and climbed up, not to drive away but to retrieve the flashlight he kept in the small storage compartment under the seat. He had carried it for years, for those mornings when he had to check under equipment or venture into the dim maintenance shed before the lights came on. Now, holding it in his hand, the weight felt heavier than it should, as if it knew it was about to shine on something long hidden. He stood at the edge of the depression again, thumbing the switch. The flashlight clicked on, casting a strong beam across the grass and down into the cracks. The light probed the uneven soil, and James leaned closer, sweeping the beam across the darkened center. For an instant, he thought he saw something, a faint glimmer of stone beneath the dirt. He blinked, leaned further, and the ground groaned beneath his weight. He jerked back, stumbling onto firmer turf, his heart pounding. The soil at the center sagged visibly now, and a thin line split open with a soft, tearing sound. Dirt sifted down into the gap like sand in an hourglass. James stood rooted in place, his breath caught in his throat. The earth was breathing, moving, alive in a way it never should be. The quiet deepened, and James realized just how alone he was. The clubhouse was still empty, no voices carried across the course, and even the hum of distant traffic from the highway seemed to have faded. It was just him, the hole in the earth, and the silence of something waiting below. He thought of leaving, of calling the head groundskeeper or even the authorities, but something stronger than fear held him there. A need to understand, to see what was truly happening beneath the land he had tended for so many years. He crouched again, holding the flashlight steady. He swept the beam across the cracked soil, and this time the light penetrated just deep enough to reveal a shadow beneath the surface. Not empty darkness, not an endless void, but a shape, a line that curved smoothly where no natural rock or soil should. The air that drifted up through the gap was colder than the morning air, carrying with it the faint smell of stone and moisture. James stood slowly, his eyes fixed on the depression. This was no mere sinkhole. This was something crafted, something with edges and intent. He felt the weight of history pressing against him, all those stories that had seemed like folklore now whispering with new urgency in his mind. The ground had kept its secrets for decades, perhaps longer, and now, for reasons he couldn't guess, it had chosen this morning to reveal them. He wiped his hands on his jeans again, though they weren't dirty, and looked out across the course. The sun was climbing higher, gilding the grass with gold, but the beauty of the morning seemed fragile now, paper thin against the revelation at his feet. James knew that whatever lay beneath him was not just a curiosity. It was something larger, something that had been hidden deliberately, something that could change everything he thought he knew about this land. A chill passed over him despite the warmth, and he realized he had reached a threshold. There would be no turning back now. Whatever choice he made, whether to leave it, to report it, or to go further, this moment would divide his life into before and after. He tightened his grip on the flashlight, took one last long breath of the morning air, and stepped closer to the unstable ground, knowing that the answers were waiting just below, and that soon he would have to face them. James stood at the rim of the depression, the beam of his flashlight cutting weakly into the growing shadow at its center. The ground seemed to breathe, as though each faint crumbling of soil was the sound of lungs exhaling after decades of silence. He swallowed hard, his throat dry, and forced himself to steady his breathing. His boots were planted a few feet from the edge, But even here the soil felt soft, uncertain, as if reminding him that one wrong step might send him tumbling into the unknown. The morning sun had risen higher now, dispersing the last of the mist across the field, yet the light did nothing to dispel the unnatural darkness of the hole. He could see more of it now. The depression was no longer a vague hollow in the grass. With the steady crumble of earth, the opening widened slightly, and the outline became clearer. James narrowed his eyes, leaning forward, adjusting the beam of his flashlight. What he saw unsettled him more deeply than he could have imagined. Beneath the loose soil, there was not simply a cavity of broken earth. The edges curved inward with purpose, forming an oval-shaped entrance that seemed too precise, too deliberate to be the work of nature. It was as though the land itself had been carved, shaped into something man-made, and then forgotten until now. He crouched low, keeping his weight carefully balanced, and swept the flashlight's glow across the emerging walls. The beam flickered against stone, not rough, jagged rock, but blocks fitted tightly, their edges softened with age and dirt. His stomach turned. Stonework beneath a golf course. It made no sense, yet there it was. He reached forward instinctively, brushing the loose soil away from a corner. His glove came away gritty, but beneath the dirt his fingers confirmed what his eyes already told him. These were bricks. Old and damp, pressed together to form a structure that had no business lying beneath a pristine fairway. James pulled back quickly, glancing around the empty course. He half expected someone else to appear, a witness to confirm what he had just uncovered, but there was no one. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional drip of soil falling into the hollow below. The weight of isolation pressed against him, heavy as stone itself. He was the only one to see this, the only one to know, and that knowledge felt like both a gift and a curse. The flashlight beam slid deeper into the opening, and James gasped softly. Beyond the arch of stone, the darkness receded into a void, a space that his light could not fully pierce. The beam reached only far enough to reveal a hint of depth, the beginnings of a corridor that stretched downward at an angle, his floor slick with soil and fragments of crumbled wood. He shifted closer, careful to stay on the firmer ground. A trickle of cold air rose from the opening and touched his face, chilling him more than the morning breeze ever could. It carried with it a scent, moisture, stone, and something metallic, faint yet undeniable, like rust that had lingered too long in dampness. For a moment, his knees felt weak. He rocked back on his heels and lowered himself to sit, his eyes still locked on the dark mouth of the passage. He tried to make sense of it. Could it be part of an old storm drain? Some forgotten piece of infrastructure buried long before the land was reshaped into the course? But the more he thought, the more he knew that explanation was too thin. The arch was too perfect, the bricks too intentional, and the corridor beyond. It was no drain. It was an entrance. James remembered the stories again, clearer now than they had ever been. His father's voice, gravelly with age, telling him about the families who had controlled this land in the past. Rumors of bootleggers hiding their caches underground, of smugglers running goods through hidden channels that spidered beneath farms and barns. As a boy, James had laughed at those tales, thinking them little more than the fabrications of men who wanted to make their mundane past sound dangerous and grand. But now, staring into the stone-lined tunnel, he realized the truth might have always been closer than he wanted to believe. He pressed his hand to the ground beside him. The soil gave slightly, and another clump slipped into the hole, vanishing into the shadows below. James jerked his hand back, his pulse spiking. He knew better than to lean too far over a collapsing edge, but curiosity burned hotter than caution. He needed to know more. The rational part of his mind urged him to step away, to call someone, to let professionals handle this, but another part, deeper and older, whispered that this discovery was his. He had worked this land, cared for it, lived alongside it for years. If anyone had the right to uncover its secrets, it was him. He pushed himself back to his feet, brushing the dirt from his jeans, and stood at the rim once more. The oval opening gaped up at him like an eye half-lidded, waiting to be fully revealed. He adjusted the flashlight again, angling it downward, and this time he noticed something else. Just beyond the arch, on the wall of the corridor, a faint glint caught the light. He focused on it, narrowing the beam. There, set into the stone, were metal fixtures, rusted rods, their ends curled and bent with age. Support beams, perhaps, remnants of some effort to reinforce the passage. His throat tightened. Someone had built this with intention, had worked to keep it standing through the weight of the earth above. James took a step back, then another. He had seen enough to understand that this was no ordinary sinkhole. This was an opening, a doorway to something buried deliberately, something designed to last. He turned and walked to his mower, his steps uneven, his mind reeling. His hands shook slightly as he placed the flashlight on the seat and leaned heavily against the frame of the cart. He felt suddenly small, like a child standing before the edge of an ocean, knowing that beneath the surface stretched depths he could neither see nor comprehend. He closed his eyes and drew in a long breath, steadying himself. When he opened them again, the course spread out before him in its serene, deceptive perfection. The fairways gleamed, the sand traps lay pristine, and the flags fluttered gently in the breeze. On the surface, nothing had changed. But James knew better. Just beneath, the ground was hollow, and within that hollow was a secret as old as the stories whispered in his childhood. The beam of the flashlight still illuminated the rim of stone, a pale glow in the widening dark. James knew he could not leave it at that. Whether he wanted to or not, whether he was ready or not, he had found the first piece of something far larger. The land had revealed its wound, and it was asking him to step through. The thought terrified him, but it also compelled him. He reached for the flashlight again, gripping it tighter than before, and took a long, silent look into the depths. The earth had opened its mouth, and James Harper, groundskeeper of Desert Pines, knew he stood on the threshold of a truth buried for decades. He felt it in the cold breath of air rising from below, in the rough texture of stone under the soil, in the silence that pressed against his ears. Whatever lay beneath the ninth hole was waiting. And though he did not yet know it, this discovery would change everything. His work, his town, his life. With one last glance over his shoulder at the empty expanse of green, James steadied his resolve. The ground had whispered for years. Now it was speaking clearly, and he could no longer pretend not to hear. James lingered at the edge of the opening longer than he realized. His knees bent, his shoulders hunched forward, as though the dark space beneath might lunge up and swallow him if he made any sudden movement. The air rising from the hollow was steady and cool, an exhalation of something ancient, and it touched his skin in a way that no morning breeze ever had. It smelled of stone and soil that had not seen the light in decades, of iron and damp wood, a smell that clung to his nostrils and brought with it an eerie reminder of basements, of forgotten cellars, of places people built to hide what they could not keep above ground. The golf course around him was brightening now under the mid-morning sun, the kind of flawless morning where members would normally begin to gather. But James could not tear himself away from the shadow below. His heart beat heavily against his ribs, but he felt a pull, the strange magnetism of curiosity that had driven him all his life to fix, to mend, to understand how things worked. He thought of leaving, of calling his supervisor or the sheriff's department right away, but something within resisted. He had found this. The earth had shown itself to him, and for once he did not want to share it with anyone else until he knew what it was. This land had been his for 2 decades, tended by his hands, nurtured under his watchful eye. If it had a secret to tell, he would be the one to hear it first. He went to the mower and retrieved a coil of rope he kept tucked into the back compartment. It was old, frayed in places, once used to haul broken equipment, but strong enough still to hold his weight. His hands trembled slightly as he wound it around a sturdy oak nearby, testing the knot, tugging it hard until he felt sure it would hold. He looped the other end around his waist, tightening it across his hips, and tucked the flashlight into his jacket pocket. He felt almost foolish. He was no climber, no adventurer, merely a man who kept the grass trimmed and the sprinklers aligned, but as he walked back to the rim of the hollow, his fear blended with a determination that surprised even him. He crouched low, shifted his boots carefully on the soil, and lowered himself inch by inch toward the mouth of the opening. Dirt crumbled under his palms, sprinkling into the darkness, and each time he felt the earth shift, his chest clenched in panic. Yet the rope held, steady and reassuring, and after a few moments his boots touched a firmer surface. He found himself standing on a ledge of stone just within the arch, the dim light from above barely illuminating the curve of the walls. He pulled the flashlight free and clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the space before him. The sight froze him where he stood. The beam revealed a corridor descending at a shallow angle, its walls lined with bricks blackened with age, streaked with moisture that glistened like sweat. Wooden beams, dark and rotting, pressed against the ceiling at intervals, remnants of an old framework meant to hold back the earth. Along the ground ran rusted rails, no wider than his palm, stretching into the shadows beyond the reach of his light. A faint trickle of water gleamed along one side, slipping toward a deeper darkness that seemed to stretch endlessly downward. James's mouth went dry. He crouched, letting his fingers graze the cold metal of the rails. The texture was rough with rust, brittle in places, but unmistakable. This had been built for movement, for transporting something through the earth. He imagined carts pushed by hands, wheels squealing in the dark, burdens heavy enough to warrant a system like this. His skin prickled as the realization sank in. This wasn't just a tunnel, this was an operation. He stepped forward cautiously, his boots scraping against the damp floor, the rope at his waist tugging slightly from the weight above. Each sound echoed far more than it should have, bouncing down the corridor and returning to him as if the walls themselves were whispering his movements back. He swept the flashlight from side to side, illuminating the remains of crates collapsed into themselves, wood eaten away by time, the iron hinges rusted to flakes. In one corner, a broken lantern lay half buried in dirt, its glass shattered, its frame corroded. He lifted it gently, dirt spilling from its base, and set it aside, his heart tightening with the eerie certainty that someone had once stood here, perhaps decades ago, holding it as he now held his flashlight. As he moved deeper, the air grew colder, denser, carrying the smell of earth pressed down for too long. Droplets of water fell rhythmically from the beams above, striking the ground with soft plinks that seemed deafening in the silence. He held his breath for a moment, listening, half convinced he could hear something more, a distant shifting, a faint rustle in the dark ahead. He tightened his grip on the flashlight and pressed forward, one slow step at a time. The tunnel widened slightly after 20 feet, opening into a chamber where the walls curved outward. Here, remnants of barrels lay toppled, their wood disintegrated, leaving only rusted bands and faint traces of blackened residue on the floor. James swept his light across the chamber and felt his chest constrict. Symbols had been scratched into the brick, crude and jagged, as though someone had carved them in haste with a knife. They were unfamiliar to him, not words, but marks, repeated over and over in uneven lines. He leaned closer, touching the grooves lightly with his gloved finger. They were shallow but distinct, the kind of marks that lasted because they had been cut deliberately. He stepped back quickly, uneasy at the thought of who might have drawn them and why. His father's stories returned unbidden, whispers of smugglers who ran liquor and weapons through hidden routes during the darker days of the past. Could this be their work? Had this chamber once been a storage site? Or worse, a place of gathering for men who never wanted their deeds brought into the light? James's pulse raced as he considered it. He lifted the flashlight again, turning slowly to cast the beam along the rest of the chamber. His light landed on something that made his breath catch. In the far corner, half covered by fallen soil and rubble, lay the outline of a wooden crate. Unlike the others, it had not completely collapsed. Its frame still held, though warped and swollen with moisture. He moved closer, kneeling carefully, and brushed the dirt aside. The wood gave beneath his touch, soft with decay, and a sharp odor rose as the soil shifted. He coughed, recoiling slightly, but leaned back in to see. The crate had once been sealed with iron nails, now rusted through, and its side bore a faded marking, too worn to read clearly. James shone the light directly on it, squinting. He could just make out the ghost of a symbol, a circle with lines radiating outward, though it was too broken to recognize. His fingers twitched with the temptation to pry the crate open, but he pulled back, the weight of caution finally overtaking curiosity. He had no idea what could lie inside, nor what it might mean to disturb it. Standing again, he let the beam sweep once more down the length of the tunnel beyond. It stretched further still, the rails running like veins into the black. He shivered, the chill in the air sinking deeper into his bones. For the first time, he felt a pulse of true fear. Not just unease, not just tension, but the primal fear of being somewhere he did not belong, somewhere built for purposes he did not understand. He turned back toward the rope, gripping it with one hand, steadying himself with a deep breath. He had seen enough for now. The tunnel was real, its construction undeniable, its purpose clear enough to unsettle him. It had been used, once, for smuggling or storage, for secrets that could not exist above ground. And though it had been abandoned for decades, perhaps longer, the signs that lingered, the fresh cracks in the beams, the unsettled soil, the sense of breath in the air, told him it was not finished speaking. James climbed back up carefully, his boots scraping against stone, the rope tightening across his waist as he pulled himself toward the light of the fairway. When, at last, he stepped free of the hole, standing again under the sun, the contrast struck him with overwhelming force. The golf course lay pristine, calm, beautiful, as though the earth had not just revealed a scar within its heart. He tore the rope from his waist, his hands shaking, and staggered back toward the mower. He sat on the seat heavily, the flashlight still clenched in his fist, and stared out across the bright expanse. Everything looked the same, and yet nothing was. He had entered the earth and touched its secrets, breathed the air of a place men had carved and hidden long before him. His mind reeled with the implications, with the sense of danger and discovery colliding within him. For a long time, he sat in silence, the mower engine cold, the rope coiled at his feet. He knew he could not keep this to himself forever, but for now, he was the only one who had seen it, the only one who knew. And that knowledge weighed on him like a stone he could neither drop nor carry with ease. The earth had given him a glimpse. He could not shake the feeling that it wanted him to return, to go deeper, to find what else had been left behind in the shadows. But as he sat there, his pulse still racing, James Harper wondered if he had the strength to face what waited beneath the ground. The sun was climbing steadily overhead, burning away the last of the morning cool, but James Harper barely noticed. He sat slumped on the seat of his mower, his eyes fixed on the distant flag at the 9th hole, though his mind was far from the game of golf. His gloves were streaked with dirt, his breath still unsteady from the climb back to the surface, and the weight of what he had seen pressed down on him like a stone pressing into his chest. Beneath his boots, beneath the flawless green that members would soon be walking across with their shining clubs and casual laughter, there was a hollow place. Not just a hole, not just a sink in the soil, but a tunnel. A passage carved and reinforced, built by hands with intention, lined with rails for moving things James could not yet imagine. The thought gnawed at him, circling in his mind as he tried to pull it apart, to make sense of it. He had always thought he knew this land better than anyone. For over 20 years he had tended its grass, shaped its hills, managed its water. He had watched the seasons change across it, studied the way the soil responded to sun and rain, memorized the smallest shifts in its surface. But now he felt like a stranger, as though the ground beneath him had been lying all along, hiding a story that no mower or sprinkler could ever touch. He closed his eyes and tried to steady his breathing, but memories began to crowd in unbidden, dragging him back to another time, another voice. His father's words came to him first, not in sharp sentences, but in the rolling cadence of stories told by firelight or over the quiet creak of a porch swing. His father had worked the farms here long before the land had been bought up and transformed into a haven for the wealthy. He had known its stubborn clay, its flood-prone hollows, its wild tangles of trees before bulldozers flattened them into fairways. And he had always said that beneath the soil there were shadows, remnants of men who had used the land for more than crops or cattle. James could hear him even now, the rasp in his voice as he leaned closer and whispered of nights when lanterns glowed where no farmhouses stood, when wagons creaked across the fields long after midnight. "They weren't farming tools, son," his father had said once, a warning in his tone. "They hauled things you don't talk about. Liquor when it was forbidden, guns when men were willing to kill for profit. Those hills swallowed more than rainwater, and what they built underground, they built to last." At the time, James had rolled his eyes, the way boys often do when elders speak of danger wrapped in mystery. He had thought them tales meant to keep him from wandering too far, meant to add gravity to a land that otherwise seemed nothing but endless fields. But now, after what he had seen, he felt those words crawl back to him with the weight of truth. He looked back at the depression behind him, at the rope still tied to the oak, dangling toward the shadowed arch below. He imagined again the rails, the beams, the symbols scratched into the walls, the crates softened with decay. every detail matched the shape of those old stories. This was not some accident of the earth. This was the skeleton of history, hidden until the soil gave way to reveal it. James shifted uneasily, his palms slick in his gloves. What if the stories had been more than rumors? What if the very families that had once ruled this land had carved out a network of tunnels to smuggle their goods? The county had long whispered of bootleggers in the days of Prohibition, of men who ran whiskey across the border under cover of night, building caches and routes the law could not follow. Later, the whispers turned to weapons, to drugs, to things that slipped through cracks in the law and into the hands of those who thrived in shadows. His father had never spoken names, but everyone in town had their suspicions of who had controlled it all. And then there was the strange fact of how quickly this land had been sold, how suddenly the farms had vanished. James remembered, faintly, the chatter in the community when he was a boy, how one by one the old families left, selling for less than the land was worth, how fires broke out in abandoned barns, how records of ownership grew muddied and unclear. It had been strange at the time, though few asked questions when the promise of a golf club meant jobs and prestige for the county. The past had been buried as quickly as the foundations were poured. Perhaps, he thought grimly, buried more literally than anyone had realized. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, and let his gaze wander across the course. It was a paradise on the surface. The manicured greens, the flawless sand traps, the tidy hedges all spoke of order and wealth. Yet, he now knew that beneath it lay something darker, something older. The thought that members would soon stroll across the 9th hole, laughing and talking of scores, while just below their polished shoes the earth hid rails and crates and symbols carved by desperate hands, made his stomach twist. And what of the symbols? He could not shake the image of them, etched hurriedly but with intention. They hadn't been random scratches. They had meant something to the men who carved them, something important enough to mark on the very walls of the place they built. James felt a prickle crawl along his spine as he considered it. Were they directions, warnings, ownership marks? Did they signify belonging to some hidden fraternity of smugglers, a code left behind in the dark? He had no answer, only the gnawing certainty that the marks were a part of a language of secrecy, one that he was not meant to understand. His hands tightened into fists on his knees. The conflict in him deepened with each passing minute. He knew he should tell someone, his supervisor, the authorities, anyone who could assess the danger. The tunnel could collapse, could swallow more of the fairway, could hurt someone if it wasn't dealt with. And yet, he recoiled at the thought of giving it up so easily. This discovery had been his. The earth had revealed it to him and him alone. He wanted, selfishly perhaps, to hold it a little longer before it was taken from him, stripped bare by strangers who would catalog and close it off. But there was fear, too. Not the fear of the earth collapsing, but of something less tangible. If the tunnel truly belonged to the past his father had whispered of, then it might still hold echoes of that world. What if he was not alone down there? What if others knew of it and still used it in ways he had not yet seen? The fresh scuffs on the beams, the soil unsettled in ways that seemed too new, it all nagged at him. The tunnel had been abandoned, yes, but had it been forgotten? Or had it simply been left for the right time to open again? James stood slowly, his legs stiff from sitting, and walked toward the rope. He touched it with a gloved hand, feeling the fibers still taut against the oak. He imagined descending again, pushing deeper, discovering more. But as quickly as the urge came, he pulled back, his chest tight with dread. He was not ready, not yet. What he had already seen was enough to rattle him, to remind him that the land carried memories far heavier than he could bear alone. He looked out across the course once more, the bright greens blazing in the sun, the clubhouse now stirring faintly in the distance. Soon others would arrive, and the illusion of perfection would return, masking the wound at the 9th hole. He felt an odd mixture of pride and sorrow. Pride that he had uncovered a truth buried beneath his land. Sorrow that it had been hidden so long and perhaps would be hidden again. The words of his father lingered in his ears. "The land doesn't forget, son." He understood them now in a way he never had before. The ground remembered the weight of men who carved into it, the echo of carts rolling along rails, the smoke of lanterns burning in secret chambers. And now it remembered him, too, the man who had dared to look beneath the surface. James Harper stood with the rope in his hand and knew he had stepped into something larger than himself. The earth had shown him its shadow, and though he wanted to turn away, he knew deep down that he could not. The secret was his now, whether he liked it or not, and sooner or later he would have to decide what to do with it. The clubhouse bell rang faintly in the distance, a dull chime that signaled staff were beginning to prepare for the first arrivals of the day. James Harper heard it as if from far away, his thoughts drowned beneath the weight of the secret lying just behind him. He stood at the edge of the 9th hole, staring down at the depression where the rope still hung like a lifeline into the earth. He had promised himself he would not descend again, that the first exploration had been enough, but already the morning light seemed too bright, too false, too fragile compared to the heavy truth below. He could not shake the thought that what he had uncovered was not finished with him, that the ground itself was daring him to return. For a while, he paced in circles. He tried to distract himself by scanning the course, checking the sprinklers, studying the flag positions, but each motion was hollow, mechanical. The rope caught his eye again and again, swaying faintly in the breeze, whispering of the darkness it reached into. He remembered the symbols scratched into the walls, the rusted rails, the half-rotted crates. He remembered the way the air had felt alive, cool and heavy against his face, as if something breathed within those walls. Fear still clung to him, but it was no longer enough to keep him away. Curiosity was louder. He tightened his gloves, tested the knot at the oak once more, and looped the rope across his waist. This time his descent was faster, less hesitant. He had already felt the stone beneath his boots, already tasted the air of the tunnel. His heart still pounded, but there was a grim determination in the rhythm now, the acceptance of a man who knew he was crossing a line he could never uncross. When his boots struck the damp floor again, the beam of his flashlight caught the rails gleaming faintly in the dark, guiding his eyes deeper into the passage. He drew a breath and began to walk. Each step seemed louder than it should have been, his boots scraping against the grit of soil and rust. The tunnel sloped gently downward, the air thickening as he moved. His flashlight beam darted across beams that looked more fragile now, each groaning softly under the weight of the earth above. He swept the light back and forth, unwilling to let shadows linger too long in any one corner. The chamber he had discovered earlier loomed once more, the crude symbols staring back at him from the walls, their meaning as alien and unsettling as before. He shivered but pressed on. The tunnel beyond narrowed, the rails cutting a precise path into the gloom. The walls were slick, moisture trickling down them in thin veins, and the ground was uneven in places where soil had collapsed. James slowed, carefully picking his way over the debris, his ears straining at every faint sound. A drip of water here, the groan of wood there, the echo of his own breathing. It all seemed magnified, as if the tunnel itself were listening to him, amplifying his presence. He tried to silence his steps, though the echo refused to be stilled. He froze suddenly. Somewhere ahead, beyond the reach of his flashlight, there was a sound. It was faint at first, barely distinguishable from the usual noises of shifting soil and dripping water, but then it came again. A shuffle, quick and deliberate, as though something or someone moved in the darkness beyond. James held his breath, his chest tight, his hand white-knuckled around the flashlight. He swung the beam forward, the circle of light slicing through the dark, but nothing appeared. Only the empty tunnel stretched ahead, rails vanishing into shadow. He swallowed hard, his mouth dry. Perhaps it had been his imagination, nerves twisting sounds into shapes they did not have. Yet he could not shake the certainty that he was no longer alone. His father's stories of smugglers and hidden men surged back into his mind, and though he told himself they were ghosts of another era, his instincts screamed otherwise. The air was too heavy, the silence too deliberate, as though something waited for him to move. Still, he pressed forward. He could not retreat now, not after coming this far. The flashlight beam revealed more remnants along the sides of the tunnel, collapsed tools, a wheel from a cart, its spokes eaten away by rust, a length of chain coiled like a snake across the ground. James's boot nudged it accidentally, and the metallic rattle echoed down the passage like a scream. He winced, every muscle in his body tensing, listening for any reply. But there was only silence. Silence so complete it seemed to swallow even his heartbeat. After what felt like an eternity, he moved on. The ground shifted subtly beneath his boots, the ceiling lowering, forcing him to stoop. The air grew colder still, each breath thick with moisture that clung to his throat. His flashlight flickered once, then steadied, the beam catching on a fresh scar in the wall. He frowned, moving closer. There, cut across the brick, were scratches, long, deep gouges that were not softened by age. He brushed his glove across them and felt sharp edges. These had been made recently, far more recently than the crates or rails or beams. Someone had been here. His pulse quickened. The scuffs were not random either. They looked like marks from tools, as though someone had tried to force open a space in the wall. He shone the light across the ground and saw fragments of brick, fresh and red, scattered amid the dust. His throat tightened. Whoever had been here had not been gone long. A sound interrupted his thoughts, a faint tremor above, followed by the groan of shifting earth. James froze, his light swinging wildly as clumps of soil trickled from the ceiling. He stumbled back as a beam overhead cracked, splintering with a sound like a breaking bone. The ground shifted beneath his boots, rails creaking, the air filled with a rain of dust. He threw himself against the wall, his arm raised to shield his face as the tunnel shook with sudden violence. For a moment, he thought it would collapse entirely, bury him alive in the place he should never have entered. Then, as quickly as it had started, the tremor subsided. Dust hung thick in the air, choking him, clinging to his skin. He coughed, fighting to draw breath, the flashlight beam cutting a pale path through the haze. The beam above sagged dangerously, splintered but holding. The ground was littered with fresh debris. He staggered forward, his chest heaving, every instinct in him screaming to flee, but the rails beckoned still, vanishing into the dark, and curiosity chained his feet. He moved more carefully now, every step cautious, the rope at his waist tugging slightly as if urging him to retreat. But he did not. He advanced, compelled by something he could not name. The tunnel curved slightly ahead, and as he rounded it, his light fell on something that froze him in place once more. There, pressed against the wall, were footprints. Clear, unmistakable footprints in the damp soil. Not old, not softened by time, but sharp and distinct, the tread of boots no more than days, perhaps hours ahead of him. James's throat constricted. His hand shook so badly that the beam of light jittered across the tunnel, catching glimpses of more scuffs, more signs of recent passage. Someone had been here. Someone might still be here. His skin prickled, every hair on his arms standing on end. The fear he had felt before was nothing compared to the dread that wrapped around him now. The tunnel was alive. It was not abandoned. The silence pressed heavier, broken only by his ragged breaths. He wanted to turn, to climb back to the surface, to run until the open air washed the shadows from his skin. But part of him could not move, transfixed by the prints, by the proof that he was trespassing not only on history, but on something current, something dangerous. He thought of his father's voice again, warning him of men who thrived in places like this, men who did not forgive curiosity. The tunnel, it seemed, was not a grave of the past, but a living vein, pulsing still with secrets. His flashlight flickered again, dimming for a heartbeat before brightening, and in that blink of darkness James thought he heard it once more, the shuffle of movement, faint but real, echoing just ahead. He swung the beam forward desperately, but the tunnel stretched empty into the black. His heart pounded, his breath shallow. He was not alone, and in that realization, with the dust still settling from the near collapse and the marks of fresh passage at his feet, James Harper knew he had crossed into true danger. The earth had shown him its secrets, but those secrets were not his to claim. Something else still walked these tunnels, something that had no intention of being found. James staggered back from the footprints, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The tunnel pressed in on him from all sides, the air thick with dust, the silence now alive with the echoes of his own terror. The discovery of fresh marks in the soil had struck him harder than the tremor or the splintering beams. Those prints were proof, undeniable proof, that he was not wandering a relic left behind by men long dead. Someone had been here, maybe still was, and he was trespassing into a living secret. He stood frozen, the flashlight trembling in his hand, the beam darting across the rails as though it might catch movement at the edge of sight. For a long moment, he felt certain that if he took one more step forward, something would answer from the dark. The decision to turn back was not an easy one. His pride urged him deeper, demanded that he not flee like a frightened child, but the deeper pull of survival screamed louder. With a shaken breath, James began to retrace his steps. The prints seemed to follow him in reverse, their shape stamped in his memory more vividly than the soil itself. He stepped carefully over debris, past the scarred beams, past the chamber with its strange symbols that now seemed more sinister than mysterious. The tunnel did not collapse again, but every groan of wood, every patter of falling soil felt like a warning. When at last he reached the rope, he gripped it with both hands as though it were salvation itself. His arms ached as he climbed, his boots scraping the wall, his body desperate to reach the light above. The rope bit into his palms, and his lungs burned with each breath, but he hauled himself upward, until his chest broke through the rim of the depression and sunlight struck his face. He scrambled onto the grass and rolled onto his back, coughing, the sky above him so blindingly bright it felt like he had awoken from a nightmare. For a long time he lay there, staring at the endless blue, the warmth of the sun clashing with the cold sweat on his skin. The world above was unchanged. The clubhouse stood in the distance, serene and stately. The flags fluttered lazily in the breeze. The sprinklers hissed faintly at the edges of the fairways. But James knew that nothing would ever be the same. He sat up slowly, his limbs trembling, and stared at the dark mouth of the tunnel that gaped like a wound in the ground. His rope still hung into the hollow, a reminder of the path he had taken and barely survived. He yanked it free with shaken hands and coiled it roughly, as though removing the only bridge between him and that place would restore some measure of safety. Yet, even with the rope gone, the hole remained, waiting. He stood unsteadily, his mind whirling. He had a choice to make. The secret beneath the golf course was not his alone anymore. The danger was too great, the truth too heavy to keep in silence. He thought of the footprints, fresh and sharp in the soil, and the sound of something moving in the dark. If he kept this hidden, he would not only be endangering himself, but anyone who walked this course unaware of what lay below. The ground could collapse again. The men who still used those tunnels, if indeed they still did, might return to find him. And James Harper knew with a clarity that chilled him that if those men were alive, they would not allow him to walk free with what he had seen. With hands that still shook, he retrieved his phone from the cart. For a long moment he stared at it, his thumb hovering over the screen, paralyzed between fear and duty. To call meant giving up his ownership of the discovery. To call meant questions, investigations, men in uniforms swarming the fairways he had tended for years. It meant that the place he had loved, shaped with his sweat, would never be the same again. Yet the alternative was unthinkable. To remain silent was to carry a secret that might bury him and others with it. Finally, with a grim resolve, he dialed. The words came haltingly at first as he explained to his supervisor what he had found, then stronger as his voice carried the weight of urgency. Soon, the call passed to the authorities, and James recounted everything. The sinkhole, the tunnel, the rails, the crates, the footprints. There was silence on the other end for a moment before the dispatcher told him firmly to stay where he was. Help was on its way. The weight was unbearable. James paced along the edge of the fairway, glancing constantly at the hole as though it might widen at any moment. The minutes stretched, and with them his anxiety grew. Every sound made him twitch. The caw of a crow, the rustle of a squirrel in the trees, each one felt like it could be the shuffle of boots emerging from the earth. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to focus on the open sky, but his eyes returned again and again to the gaping wound in the ground. At last, the sound of sirens reached him, distant but unmistakable. Relief flooded his chest, mingled with dread. Vehicles rolled across the course, stopping near the 9th hole. Uniformed officers climbed out, their faces taut with curiosity and concern. James guided them to the depression, speaking quickly, pointing to the arch below, to the rope marks, to the scattered soil. They peered down, their eyes narrowing as they took in the sight. One of them muttered something under his breath, and James caught the word tunnel. More arrived within the hour. County deputies, engineers, then men in plain clothes whose badges glinted faintly in the sun. They spoke in low voices, securing the area, stringing up tape to block off the fairway. James stood back, feeling both like an intruder and a guardian. He watched as ropes and harnesses were brought out, as men with helmets descended into the hollow he had discovered. His stomach tightened as he imagined them walking where he had walked, shining their brighter, steadier lights on the same symbols, the same crates, the same rails that had unsettled him so deeply. When the first officer returned, his face was pale. He spoke quickly into a radio, his words too hushed for James to catch, but the urgency in his tone was clear. Soon, more vehicles arrived. Federal agents this time, their presence unmistakable in the way others deferred to them. They carried equipment, cameras, tools. They descended one by one, disappearing into the earth. Hours passed as James lingered at the perimeter, no longer allowed near the opening but unable to leave. He could not tear himself away from the place where his life had split in two. When, finally, one of the plain-clothed agents approached him, notebook in hand, James felt his chest tighten. The questions came: his name, his years working at the club, how exactly he had found the sinkhole, what he had seen inside. He answered each carefully, the memory still vivid, the fear still fresh in his veins. The agent scribbled notes, his expression unreadable, then nodded curtly. "You did the right thing," he said simply before moving away. That night, long after the authorities had finished their first inspection and sealed off the site with heavy boards and warning tape, James remained. He stood at the edge of the course, the sky now dark and scattered with stars, and stared at the ground that had betrayed its secret. He felt both smaller and heavier than he had ever felt in his life. The discovery had begun with curiosity, but it had ended with men swarming his land, turning his quiet world into an investigation. And yet, he knew it could not have been otherwise. The town would soon know. The newspapers would spread the story, the whispers would begin, and once more the old legends would rise to the surface. The tunnel was no longer just his secret. It belonged now to history, to law, to the world beyond his mower and his gloves and his quiet pride. James Harper, the quiet groundskeeper, had become the man who uncovered it. And though he did not seek the role, he would carry it with him forever. He turned to leave at last, the fairway stretching before him like a ribbon in the moonlight. He paused once, looking back at the taped-off hole, and a shiver ran through him. He thought of the footprints again, fresh in the soil, and of the faint shuffle he had heard in the dark. He thought of the possibility that whoever had left those marks had not been buried in the collapse, had not vanished into history, but still walked somewhere beyond, aware now that their tunnel had been discovered. James pulled his jacket tighter around him and walked slowly toward the clubhouse, the night air cold against his skin. The land had revealed its memory, and he had borne witness. But deep in his chest he knew the story was not finished. The ground never forgets, and what it remembers does not always rest quietly once disturbed. This was just one of the shocking discoveries hiding beneath everyday life. And there are even more unbelievable stories waiting for you. Don't miss out. Hit subscribe right now and turn on the bell so you never miss what happens next. Watch our other videos for even more hidden truths and share this one with your friends.